So my name is Marta Darby, and I'm a second-year law student here at Stanford. And before we get things underway, we have 3 lost and found items. So if it's yours, just take note, and we'll leave it up here, and you can come grab it after the panel. So we have a small black key. It looks kind of like a bike key, maybe. So that's up here. These are left behind at lunchtime. We have a small purple thumb drive, also left behind. This was up here at the panel, and then also a lovely brown shirt that was left behind at lunch as well. So if it's yours, please come up and grab it after the panel. Good way to find out. We can certainly do that. So this afternoon, I have the pleasure of introducing our last panel. It's the Ocean Conservation Evaluation and Monitoring Panel. We will build upon the themes that we've begun to consider over the last day and a half, namely the opportunities and challenges of monitoring and enforcement in dynamic marine areas. So we'll touch upon the current state of technology, best practice methodologies, the legal regimes, and the surrounding politics. To kick us off, we'll have Lieutenant Commander Gregg Casad, who will discuss the risks associated with living marine resource enforcement and how these risks can be incorporated into management systems. Gregg serves as the U.S. Coast Guard's liaison to NOAA and as the Department of State's Bureau of Oceans and International Environment and Scientific Affairs. Next, we'll move on to our second panelist. We'll have Hugh Passingham, who will discuss habitat representation and the role of industry in constraining conservation outcomes. He'll provide insight into the Great Barrier Reef and Australia's recent rezoning of the EEZ to create one of the world's largest systematically designed marine protected areas. He was a professor of mathematics and ecology at the University of Queensland, and he also directs the Australian Research Council's Center of Excellence for Environmental Decisions, and his lab developed the world's most widely used conservation planning software, MARSM. Our third panelist will be Phil McGillivary, who will discuss how autonomous systems can be used to monitor and enforce marine protected areas. And he will also consider how these systems can be used in combination with other technologies in order to facilitate more dynamic management. Phil is a science liaison for the U.S. Coast Guard and has spent more than 2 years at seas on research vessels and submersibles. Finally, we'll move on to Greg Poulos, who will address the legal status of autonomous marine vehicles, particularly those engaged in scientific endeavors. He'll provide insight into how autonomous marine vehicles are considered under U.S. law and regulations, and particularly in light of recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions. Gregg is the founding partner of Cox, Wootton, Grifฟี่, Hansen, and Poulos, a San Francisco-based law firm specializing in maritime law. He also serves on the Strategic Advisory Board for Liquid Robotics, a company developing an autonomous marine robotic platform. And with that, we'll get started.
Well, good afternoon. First, I want to say thank you to the organizers of the event. As an enforcement guy, sometimes people like to talk about us. They like to say, "Oh, those enforcement people. This is what enforcement is. This is what it is not." And for us to actually be at the table and have an opportunity to talk about and explain some of our thoughts, or at least my thoughts. And this gives me the opportunity to say that the opinions expressed are those of Gregg Casad. They do not represent the United States Coast Guard nor the Department of Homeland Security, to whom I pledge allegiance. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today, and I hope that I'm gonna get my outcome out first. Engage us. Engage us. Talk with us. We want to help. We really do. I know sometimes we're difficult, sometimes we're a little bit obstinate, but we really do want to help. So let me go through I am going to go through these slides very fast. And partly because there's been such great discussions over the last almost now 2 days, there's some issues that I want to talk about that are outside of what I prepared prior to showing up. So I'm going to go through these slides real quick because that's what I promised I'd talk about, and then I'm going to get on to the things that hopefully will lead to some questions. And I'm going to do that all under 15 minutes because we're running late. All right, so opportunity to discuss a framework. This is my framework. This is a framework that I think about when I talk to managers, talk to scientists. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then obviously, I want to learn. I want to learn. So I've been here to listen and have the opportunity to absorb some of the information that's been provided. All right, I already talked about my objectives. Boom. So what do we do? Why do I do what I do? Why do we do enforcement? We do it to advance national objectives. We're not out there to enforce it just because. There's some stated purpose that we're out there for, whether it be optimal yield, to make sure that the information is the best available information for the science side so that we have faith in that the rules are being followed. But there's some overarching reason why we go out to do these things. And so that is what enforcement does. We're there to advance those national policies. Subsequent with that is helping people understand and mitigate those risks. What are your risks? Our job is, as managers, they make a decision. They say, we want X, Y, Z from a management perspective. Our job is to make sure that X, Y, and Z are followed so that those management objectives can be met. Not necessarily whether I agree with them or not, that is my job. So, people like to talk about the three-legged stool, so you talk about the science side of it. You have to have good science feeds good management, and then once you have management, thus you have to have somebody out there to make sure there's compliance with those rules have been put in place. What I would say is that enforcement and what we do should be feeding back into both of those other legs. So as scientists, let me see if my next slide, all right, I'll stop for a second. As scientists, you're doing your modeling. How, am I too far away? Okay. No. Yeah, trust me, I can sound off with the best of them. Something about that military training, even if I am in a suit today. As scientists, how does enforcement information, how does noncompliance fit into your modeling? Where are you getting your information? What's your level of uncertainty with the information you've received? Do you trust it? Are you asking for it? What is it? So, this is Greg Casad's framework, and thus a framework, not the framework. And this is related to enforcement. So I approach this, and I say there are 4 different groups of individuals out there. All right? There are those, you tell them what to do, and by God, they're going to do it. They're going to follow the rules because they believe it's the right thing to do. There are those who are going to say, I tried to read Cal Fishing Game's pamphlet for recreational fishing, and I really did, but I still screwed up. Right? I just made a mistake. I didn't understand it. And then there are those who will say, I saw all the Coast Guard boats tied up this morning. I know they're not out there patrolling, so I'm opportunistic. If I think I can get away with it, I'm going to do it. And then there's the final group, and that's the group that, for whatever reason, they don't believe in it, they find the economic returns to be great enough, that they're just going to go out and they're going to do things that are illegal, contrary to the regs. And so when you think about how do you do these things, how do you address each of those different groups? And I think this applies whether you're talking about in a developed state like the United States in a domestic context, or whether you're talking about this in small-scale fisheries in the developing world. The same concepts apply. So those people in that bottom 2 groups, I want to educate them because that's relatively inexpensive. It's relatively inexpensive. It takes time, it takes effort. I'm not saying it's cheap. I'm not saying that it doesn't cost money, but it's relatively speaking to putting a Coast Guard ship on scene, it's cheap. So same with those opportunistic people. We want to be out there. We have to be out there. We have to be looking. We have to engage. We have to do random inspections. We have to make people feel like there's a level playing field, and if I violate the rules, I will be held accountable. That's that deterrence piece. And then there's the last group. And what we have to do to get for them is we have to pursue them. We have to pursue them. We have to root out those bad actors and hold them accountable. Now, that's the most expensive piece. I'm not cheap. All evidence to the contrary. The Coast Guard is expensive. You want to put a large Coast Guard cutter off the coast to do a boarding, it's not cheap. It's not cheap. So when we go, we want to be doing it and doing the right things and hitting the right people. I don't want to have to spend my time, and this sounds slightly off, but education, there are other ways to educate. I'm more than happy to do it as I'm doing my deterrence work, and I will continue to do so, but there are other ways, less expensive ways to do that. All right, so this is, I've already talked about that. So what leads to compliance factors? These are, if you go back and read Becker, you read some of the other articles that have been written about, criminology and some of the, why do criminals do what they do? These are the same concepts that are out there. They've been talked about for years. This is nothing new, so I will move on. So here's some questions. How critical to your management goals is enforcement? Is it? I don't know. Guess it depends on what you're trying to do. How much risk are you willing to accept? Those are policy decisions. And then what tools are you going to have as a manager to see those rules, those decisions that have been made follow through? All right, so these are some questions that I'll put out there, and I'm going to go through these real quick because I'm already talking too long. What does compliance mean to you? What is success? What does that look like? Is it 100%? Is everybody following the rules? Or is there something less than that? And that's success. Managers, scientists, what do you need from me? What do you need from my counterparts to deal with enforcement? What information will be helpful to you? Sometimes I can share it, sometimes I can't. But if you don't ask for it, you'll never get it. The last one, how are you measuring it? How are you measuring compliance? Is it based off of what I told you? Is it based off of what the state told you? Is it based off of what you heard from the WCPFC, Technical Compliance Committee, the TCC? Is that what compliance is? I don't know. Well, I do, but I'll leave it hanging out there. So just some additional questions as you think about the risks. Perfect. I'm right on time. These are the questions I think that managers have to be asking themselves about how do you deal with these trade-offs, these risks associated with it. And I was so happy to hear yesterday people talking about risk. And because you can just make a decision to put something in place that's squiggly lines that I can't enforce. And that's fine. That's a policy decision. Just realize your non-compliance risks have gone up. Are you willing to accept those risks? If the answer is yes, fantastic. Please let me know. My resources can probably be better placed to deal with other issues. I think, all right, that's the end of it. So I wanted to talk a little bit. Yesterday I got a little depressed. Yesterday afternoon in the discussion about international. And so I wanted to run through really quickly on a couple of things that are out there that I think are good things. I think we're heading in the right direction. First one, and I mentioned it earlier this morning, port state measures. This is a binding agreement. It's about identifying bad actors and holding them to account. You cannot come into my ports because you've engaged in IUU fishing. You cannot get fuel. You cannot trade out your crew. you cannot offload your catch. You are a bad actor. Go find someplace else. And what does that do to the economists in the room? It increases their costs. And why do I engage in IUU fishing? I do not engage in IUU fishing because I like to destroy the environment. I do it to make money. So to the extent that you can increase their costs, sometimes you can change behavior. Flag state performance criteria. This is a recent set of criteria that came out of the FAO that basically lays out what are those responsibilities as a flag state. What are you supposed to be doing? And it provides some ability for either a self-assessment or for third-party assessments of a country to see whether or not they're meeting their obligations as they are laid out under UNCLOS, Fish Stocks Agreement, straddling, yada, yada, yada. Keep going down the compliance, all those different pieces. So that's another piece that's out there. We'll see whether or not it's effective. It just went out. It still hasn't been approved. Kofi will take it up next year. Multilateral organizations, MCS committees. Used to be monitoring, control, and surveillance. Sorry, acronym soup. Committees that are part of RFMOs. RFMOs are actually talking about compliance. That is a good thing. Who's represented there? Who are the people on those committees? Are they policy people? Are they enforcement people? Who are they? That's an important question for people to be asking. The people giving advice to these RFMOs, are they the right people? Another one that's out there, International Monitoring, Control, and Surveillance Network. This is an informal network that allows practitioners to share information. It's a great piece of the puzzle that helps people out. We talked a little bit about Interpol. This is for those criminal investigators. I want information about a suspected criminal issue. I can reach out to another country. One of the problems we have as enforcement is if I want to take something into court to prosecute someone, there's certain criteria and thresholds I have to meet to bring that into court. And so you have to have the processes in place to be able to exchange that information. Last example, at a bilateral level, the U.S. government has signed 9 shipwrighter agreements in the Pacific Islands. What this allows us to do is to use the authority and jurisdiction of that coastal state, those officers from that state on board a Coast Guard vessel or on board a Navy platform to go out and enforce their laws, their regulations with the assistance of the U.S. government. And this is a tremendous value add to those countries who do not have patrol boats or have very limited ability to do that. We also have a similar agreement with China dealing with high seas drift net, which I would love to talk about, but that's another 10 minutes. So my last thing I would say, because I'm probably at my time limit, is what can you do? And what I will tell you is my organization, large organizations like ours, are driven by policy. And the top policy is the national security strategy. That drives, every federal agency is trying to link what they do to the national security strategy because that actually helps you win your battle with OMB when you're trying to get your budget. This is how you convince people that what you're doing, national security strategy comes out of the White House, it's the president's statement about what's important for him for the next 4 years. You link yourself to that, that drives activity. Out of that comes 2 quadrennial reviews, one from the Department of Defense, the QDR, and one from the Department of Homeland Security. Those reviews drive the policy and the actions of the agencies. There is a public process to that. There is an ability for people to comment and to let the decision makers know what are your priorities. Take those opportunities to get involved. They're slightly outside of what you're probably used to, but those are things that can drive the activities of the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, which is where the Coast Guard resides. And with that, I'm willing to take half a question.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Havis from UNC Chapel Hill. I was wondering if you could just say something more about this shipwriter agreement. I hadn't heard of that before, so I was wondering if is it specific to the Coast Guard or any other military branches, or if you could offer a couple of examples of times it's been used, how it's working a little more? Thanks.
Sure. So within the U.S. government, the Department of Defense does not have law enforcement authority. That whole posse comitatus thing, they can't do that. We worry about them taking over the world and running a military coup, so we don't allow that. Somehow the Coast Guard's exempt from that. So we have the law enforcement authority to do such things. Not to take over the government, not to imply from the coup perspective, to be perfectly clear. So what happens is we have agreements, bilateral, so a U.S. government agrees with, for example, Kiribati, that we are going to do certain things, and what we do is they come on board our vessel when we're out there on patrol, and they bring their law enforcement officers. So they bring their authority to board a vessel, to stop a vessel. So sorry, let me back up a little bit. So law enforcement guy, there's two things I need. I need authority, and I need jurisdiction. Authority means someone told me I can take law enforcement action. Jurisdiction's where the vessel is and the activity they're engaged in. So I need those two things. What this does is allows those people, in this case Kiribati, to go out and actually exercise their authority, their jurisdiction over vessel activities that are in their waters. I will use the example of the agreement we have with China, which has to do with high seas drift nets. And this last year, there's been two good cases in the last year that if you look up high seas drift net and Coast Guard, you'll find them. But last year, Coast Guard, as part of underneath the umbrella of the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission, NPAFC, and also the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, WCPFC, which both have prohibitions against the use of high seas drift nets, the Coast Guard stopped and boarded a vessel that claimed to be Indonesian flagged. That vessel, subsequently, we reached out to the Indonesians. The Indonesians said, not our boat. That boat is not ours. And so we went through the process of, and my apologies to the international law people in the room, that vessel became without nationality, thus subject to the rules and laws of other nations. Working through the bilateral agreement relationship the U.S. had with China, we reached out. We had Chinese shipwriters on board our U.S. ship, which is kind of a rare thing. Sometimes China and the United States, and I don't know, relationships may be a little tense sometimes, especially on maritime issues. And we were able to work it out where instead of dragging that vessel, which was owned by a Chinese company and crewed by Chinese folks, bringing it all the way back to the United States, we were able to work with the Chinese to take that vessel and take it back into port and in effect use their authority and jurisdiction over the vessel. And then subsequently they actually destroyed the vessel. They actually took it apart, which is far faster than we would have been able to do that under our system. We still have one. We still have a vessel from 2010 where we did a similar thing, but we made a different decision and decided to bring the United States. It's still sitting in a U.S. port waiting for us to be able to scrap it, which will cost us several, if I understand correctly, will cost us I won't say the dollar figure, a significant amount of money for that to happen. So that's one example, and I'm more than happy to provide others offline.
David Friesen, you've still got time for another question. Just to follow up from the exchange you had with Christina this morning, I know that the EU has been doing a series of reviews of countries which are notorious flags of convenience. You had a question about this. I know they did one in Belize. Belize was one of the most notorious reflagging sea states, which really did make a difference. And I think they're just recently doing Vanuatu. One of my friends was actually involved, and they said it's a very rigorous system. Now, does the US do similar things as well? Because the result of, if you don't pass this review, then your vessels can't bring, or your country can't actually import goods into the EU. So there's a similar process, do I understand correctly? There's one for the US as well?
So there is. It's slightly different than the EU's. What we have is if a nation, every 2 years, Congress has directed the Secretary of Commerce through the Fisheries Service to issue a report on nations that have engaged in IUU. And that's the big, broad IUU. So if you didn't report your science data to ICAT, that could be a reason for listing a nation. If you actually engaged in what the I part of the IUU violated, some conservation management measure of an RFMO, that would be another reason why you could be listed. So the NOAA spends 2 years collecting information. There's a public process associated with that, where they ask for information from NGOs, the public, anybody who wants to submit information to them. They then look at that, reach out to the countries to say, hey, we've got this information that you've done X, Y, Z, and the countries then have a chance to respond. If the country does not provide, doesn't provide a satisfactory response, then the agency could make a determination to list that nation as having engaged in IUU. That leads to another 2 years of negotiations with them to bring them up to speed. At the end of that 2 years, if that nation hadn't sufficiently addressed the issues, then the president has the authority to look at trade measures. And it does reside at that level. It's not within the Secretary of Commerce. It rolls up a little bit up the food chain, as it were.
Have there been any examples?
So there have. NOAA has actually released, there are 3 reports in at this point. But there hasn't been anybody who's gotten, oh shoot, there might have been someone who got a negative certification this year. But there is, so NOAA, NOAA.gov, international section, there's an entire webpage dedicated to this, and there are some very dedicated folks on the NOAA staff who could speak much more eloquently to it than I can. I'm just the lowly little fish cop guy. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, and I agree. I like being at a meeting with lots of different people from all over the place. So I'm partly mathematician, partly ecologist, partly bird watcher, partly geographer. I'd like to be an economist, but they won't let me join. So it's great to have a lot of disparate people talking about a lot of interesting things. And even though my talk probably doesn't quite fit here and I've changed it, so I'm not doing what Meg told me to do, there is some interesting overlap with the previous talk about compliance, and we'll get to that in a second. I'm going to talk about spatial conservation planning, and particularly I rearranged a lot of my talk based on what I heard yesterday, just so that we're all clear about how it works and what it does and what it can't do. So that's the theme. I would have liked to talk a bit more about monitoring, evaluation and science. I'll give you 4 very pithy and annoying points. Number 1, do I need more data to build an NPA? Well, Australia built an NPA of 3 million square kilometres over an area of 9 million square kilometres with about 1/100th of the data that the United States or Canada or Europe has. So you don't need a lot of data to build a marine protected area system. Anybody who says it's a good way of actually people who don't like marine protected areas stopping them happening, is they say you need more data and they give scientists lots of money. Evaluation, people like saying, do marine reserves work? And I think if you actually asked a 5-year-old, I'm killing fish here, I'm not killing them here, what do you think will happen where I'm not killing them? Oh, there's more of them, and some of them are bigger. So how many times we've done that? We've done that 150 times, and people still don't believe it, and we still have to keep proving it. It's a bit like testing gravity every time you wake up, just in case you fly outside the atmosphere. A lot of people monitor a lot of things in marine reserves. I would say, for example, monitoring things. You need to monitor things that actually allow you to do something different, and so much of monitoring is not like that. So if your monitoring is looking at compliance and poaching, that's good, because if it's going badly, you go and fix it. If it's the genetics of some damselfish, I've annoyed the geneticist in some outer reef, I really don't care, because it's probably not going to tell me anything in the near future that's going to help me. There's a lot of information that scientists want us to collect on these things, which they like collecting for their publications, but probably the chance it will provide value for information is extremely low. And I'll talk a bit about the enforcement in a minute. What is systematic conservation planning? Hopefully you all know that. I'm just going to run through the Great Barrier Reef example quickly. I'm going to briefly explain what our software does. It is used by over 110 countries now for land and terrestrial and marine conservation planning. Most countries that are building marine conservation plans are using Marxan. And then I'm going to talk about all the things that people don't know it can do, and I wish they would use it, but they get a bit messier. And also it's actually a lot simpler than people think it is. I really do nothing at all, and these are the people that do the work that are in this talk, but for every one of them there's another 10 in my lab. It's a lab of about 80 people, and they just slave away and make me look good. So first thing I like to say is I don't want to take any credit away from all those people. Eddie's in there as well when he was a PhD student. These systems of MPAs, you know, a lot of them were put in places without a systematic approach, particularly a long time ago. I think the rule that determined where an MPA was about 20 years ago was marine biologist goes in water with scuba gear, finds lots of stuff. Hey, there's lots of stuff down there. I didn't know there were 5,000 species of this. This should be a marine park. That was it. So it wasn't very systematic, and we did the same on the land. Fortunately, in the sea, we didn't have a big marine park system when the whole field of systematic conservation planning, which started in the 80s, let me be clear about that, well before I was involved, so we've basically been able to be much more systematic about our processes. And that is what Marxan solves, the problem that Marxan solves, and it looks like a lot of maths, but it's not modelling, it's maths that's translated humans' hopes, dreams and aspirations into 3 equations. And all that says is this. It says, get me some conservation targets. I want 2,000 hectares of seagrass. I want a viable population of dugong. That's what that says. Do it so it pisses off as few people as possible. Minimise my costs. That's Australian, so we swear a lot. So, minimise my costs, make it reasonably compact so the Coast Guard guy can patrol it, and every place can be in or out of the reserve system. In fact, the new versions allow every place to be any one of many, many zones, all of which have different costs and different effects. That's all that Marxan does. People say this is a complicated piece of software. It solves a trivial problem that mathematicians could work out solving 50 years ago. So it's not at all complicated, and the maths can be translated into English, which is not modelling, it's translation. Somebody told you when you were 12 that maths is a language, remember that? That's translation of English into maths. So the software does it. As I say, that's what all the software does. It assumes you know a bit about the things you care about. The beauty of software, why do you need decision support tools? Otherwise, these decisions are made in a non-transparent fashion, and they can be biased, they can involve corruption. So decision support tools helps us make decisions that are much more transparent and open, and as Eddie explained with the choiceful experiment, choiceful stuff can actually involve the people doing them then and there. To give you quickly an idea of how it really simply works is you just think of a problem like this. There's some places I can conserve, there's some species, and you can think of fish if you like, they're birds, and there's species that live in places. The task is get me a population, everywhere there's a 1, the species is in the place, get me the smallest number of sites, assuming they all cost the same amount, that will conserve everything at least once, if that's your target. And so if you go to the richest site, if you go to the hot spot, we'll take A, then we need B and C, so we can save all the species with 3 sites, that will cost you $3 million. If you actually realise that hotspots don't tell you what to do, you can actually find you can conserve every single species with sites C and E, because they're complementary, and I've just saved you $1 million. Okay? This is a very simple problem, but you could probably guess that answer. It tells you hotspots, species richness maps are of no use for conservation planning. Species distribution maps are great for conservation planning. Hotspots maps are just going to confuse people because they just cost you $1 million. And if all these costs were very different, it'd be more confusing. The Great Barrier Reef had 17,000 sites and 250 columns. The number of possible solutions to that is 2 to the power 17,000, which is 10 to the power 500, 10 to the power 500. The number of protons in the universe is 10 to the power 80. I haven't counted them, but that's what the physicists tell me. So you do need some software to help you doing this. You can't just randomly draw lines on maps and think you're going to get a good answer. Bottom line. Greedy is not good. Okay? These things cannot simply be solved by looking at distribution maps, and particularly they should never be solved by ignoring costs and social factors. So how did the Great Barrier Reef got rezoned? Before this it was 4.7% conserved. It probably actually at the start may have been 0% conserved. At that point most of the world thought the entire thing was fully protected from fishing, but only 4.7 was protected. And we had all this data on species and costs from various agencies. There's the kind of background data you have. The target is to get 20% of everything. So all these bioregions, a lot of species distribution models we use, divided up into 17,000 planning units, each of which could be in or out of the reserve system, and then you end up with the rezoning. That then goes through a long political process, gets messed up a bit. The remarkable thing about the Great Barrier Reef rezoning, the lowest level of protection of any feature was 19.8%. 19.8%. There is not a single terrestrial reserve system in the world that is that equitable with respect to representation. Nowhere. They almost got their 20% target everywhere. So one thing I'd warn you against is never allow the politicians to push you away from having clear targets. Because once you do that, you'll find the most valuable marine areas will get zero protection. The most profitable marine areas will get zero protection. So the objective, as I said, is to annoy as few people as possible, but still meet all these targets. That's the key. That's all it does. That's the kind of data that underpins this sort of stuff. So commercial fishing data, but also recreational fishing data, also Indigenous interests. So sometimes Indigenous groups wanted marine reserves in certain places, sometimes they didn't want marine reserves in certain places. And these all influence the costs that went into the program, spat out some answers that then they meddled around with. In the end, it was a very good example of systematic conservation planning, and obviously you need to set all these targets very carefully. Okay, so that's old news. It's 9-year-old news. We can do a lot more other things with systematic conservation planning. And Eddie alluded a bit to that. He's also done some other work which he didn't talk about, is how do you deal with things that you can't, catastrophes you can't control, threats you can't control, like coral bleaching, maybe you can't control also runoff. What do we do with that? And if they're things you're actually, the threats that you are unstoppable, then we can revise our plans. There's a probabilistic version of Marxan that puts a threat on every site. It could be a threat from poaching. It could be a threat from coral bleaching. We can put that threat on and that changes our plan. So if we ignore the threats, we'll have high priority reefs here. If we then include the threat of freshwater inundation, the priority sites change a little bit. We have the redder it is, the higher the priority. If we then allow for thermal bleaching, we get a different set of reefs. If we put them both in, we get a slightly different set of reefs. So all those things, risks can be factored in to conservation planning. That's that first point there. Zoning can be now done. So this is an example of an implemented process that involved, again, a lot of people from the Nature Conservancy, a lot of people from CI, west of where Eddie talked about. We're over here, and this work driven by Hedley Grantham, over here at the Bird's Head with all these islands here. Incredibly diverse marine system, arguably the most diverse marine system in the world. We didn't just say there's a reserve or not a reserve. We had 3 zones. You can have a reserve, you can have a not a reserve, and then you can have a particular place that is dedicated to a particular group of fishing people who fish in a particular way. So they told us where they fish, and we wanted to make sure we weren't just equitable and representative across habitats, but no individual group was massively disadvantaged. So we then set a target of 20% conservation for the conservation features, but everybody would keep at least 80% of their own fishing grounds. Nobody would lose more than 20%. So now we're trying to get social equity by putting fishing zones in for particular groups, and we're trying to get equity across the habitat types. And that's possible. If you do a standard Marxan output, we just say there's no take reserves. They actually liked having the marine reserves red, not green. That sort of actually makes some sense, because you can't go there, can you? Stop, anyway. So they didn't want maps where the green zones were green. And then this is an area now where these are places which are now for the local communities to fish in. So you can do zoning. The interesting thing is when they did it as a community with crayon and pieces of butcher's paper, they ended up with quite a different plan. And they did this before Marxan was used, and they were quite wedded to their plan. Their plan was actually highly inequitable and was very poor for representation, but we realised they were wedded to it, so we then tried to work out how much of their plan could we include in the Marxan solution, still get good representation and equity across the fishing villages. So we did all that as well. And I think I've covered There has been a little bit of a talk about it today. I think, again, Eddie talked about it, other people have talked about it. In many of these regions, by far the biggest threat to marine systems is in fact runoff, sediments, nutrients, pollutants. That's probably the biggest threat now in the Great Barrier Reef by far. Probably 2 or 3 times more than fishing. Can we use conservation planning tools to solve that problem? Yes. All you have to do is think about not just planning in the sea, but planning in the land and the sea. So this is work that's done with Carissa Klein, but particularly Stacey Jupiter from Wildlife Conservation Society in Fiji. And there we actually asked the question, which bits of forest in Fiji would we conserve to deliver the biggest benefits for coral reef? So we can do fishing reserves, but if there's heaps of runoff from agriculture and nutrients and sediments, then those reefs will be messed up. So how do we prioritise that? And these are the highest priority or the most cost-effective forests to lock up, these red ones, that will deliver the greatest benefits outside here in the reef system. And the amazing thing is, this is the amount of forest protected, and this is the amount of reef protected. For 2% of the protected forest, we get 25% of the benefits. So if you just protected forest randomly because you thought it was good, you protect 2% of the forest, you'll get 2% of the benefit. If you use conservation planning software, you get your benefit multiplied by at least 10. So it is worth being smart, and of course forests all had different costs, and there was all the runoff was going out to different reefs, and all those things were quantified with fairly simple models. And that's published. And finally, something that I was reminded of yesterday, so I didn't have a really good slide for it, but we had a lot of data there on bycatch. So this is a paper that's in a ridiculously obscure journal that nobody can ever read or get to. Basically, we used data on bycatch, and instead of just having fixed reserves, so every site was a place, every site is now a place and a time. And then this project, you minimise the impact on the fishing while maximising while reducing the bycatch at the same time. And so we can actually create temporal reserves that change in time and space that cost the fishing industry very little, but massively reduce the bycatch. So all the data we saw yesterday about seabirds and all these bycatch things, that can be all whacked into Marxan and put in seasonal programs to get the best outcome for the minimum cost. So last thing I'll say, Australia did all this stuff, and so Great Barrier Reef went, well, surely when we did this rezoning, which just got released last year, and everybody thinks it's wonderful, it's 2.3 million square kilometres, wonderful system, they use software to do this. Did it turn out okay? Not particularly. And some of our work analysing this has been commented on, I think, in Nature just a month ago, and our paper was highlighted as paper in marine policy. In fact, you don't have to be a genius to realise that maybe this rezoning didn't go so well. This green stuff is the complete no-take areas. And this bit is good. This is the Great Barrier Reef and Coral Sea. Great. You know, in fact, extremely well protected. But look around here. And then if you look a little bit closer around there, this is the northwest. This is a huge stretch of sea. We're talking about 1,000 kilometres at least of coastline. This is the only substantial marine reserve. It is the only thing that is not on the shelf. These are all the petroleum and gas exploration licences. So for the last 10 years of my life, I've been talking to fishing groups, thinking they're the people I'm having a fight about with marine parks. I was wrong. There are people far more powerful than fishermen, far more powerful than fishermen, an order of magnitude. If they don't like you putting a green zone over the tiniest probability they could extract a cubic centimetre of oil or gas from the sea, they will stop you. That's it. So by any measure, we ended up with a great result here. Protection equality, 80%. That means we have a measure of the measures representation. The last important point I want to make here is actually countries keep talking about how much they're protected. That's great. But the second thing is how representative it is. And we have a measure using the Gini coefficient that's called protection equality, a one number that tells you how representative you are. The Great Barrier Reef is actually more representative than any terrestrial reserve system in the entire world. But if you look at our other areas, that just means they're massively biased towards particular habitat types. They're massively underrepresented, and we can represent it with a single number. So all those people who have anything to do with global policy, you've got to get countries to report and evaluate on a second number, not just we made 20% of our country marine protected areas. Was it all the places that you really didn't care, the deep sea stuff and so forth? They're my final thoughts. I'll just end with shameless advertising. We, as two centres of 150 people across 4 universities, write lots of papers and nobody reads them. So we write a monthly magazine called Decision Point. And Decision Point comes out every month. And if you sign up, you can get it. And we have this genius, who's the most important person in all our centres, called David Salt. And his job is to read our turgid, impenetrable, maths-filled papers and write 1 or 2 pages about them that goes to almost all Australian managers in state and federal agencies, so they can understand what it means for their work and their policy. And so if you want to see a good example of communication of science, David Salt is a genius. Thank you very much.
I have a quick question for you, Hugh. I've been working with the University of Queensland folks with Srini Srinivasan and Nico Leach. And so I've been very interested in what's happening in Northwest Australia. And part of, I have a considerable confusion, and we've had some concerns about the Australian Coast Guard and their responses to ship groundings and oil spills. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the enforcement for that.
I know I won't actually, because I know so little. Anything I say will be silly. I mean, the only thing I can say is we can include enforcement in the design by pointing out the places that are hard to enforce we can make more expensive. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? We can also, we have been working with Wildlife Conservation Society to use this sort of mark-sand to decide where to enforce. So mark-sand doesn't actually tells you how to prioritise actions in space, but it can be any action. So if we have a statistical model of poaching or some sort of poaching intensity from Australians or other countries, we can actually tell the Coast Guard, using mark-sand, where to go to have the biggest impact in stopping poaching. So I don't know, that, mind you, the military invented operations research. That's why we have decision science, because they invented it. I no doubt have better software to tell them how to do that, but there is a way of optimising patrols using the same software. But I don't know enough about what actually goes on. It's millions of miles from anybody in this part of the world, sadly. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, Hugh. Olani Wilhelm from NOAA. So first of all, that was fantastic. I really, really appreciate it. I've heard about Mark Sand for a long time, but you really broke it down in a way that was helpful, and I'd love to talk to you about ways to apply that with the Big Ocean Network. But specific to the Western Australia or this marine network, so what do you guys do now? So how do you apply this tool with the mess that you have, with the powers that are bigger than the powers before? So what do you do now? So
it's not all bad, because again, the Great Barrier Reef was zoned, and it was 4.7% protected, and it was a very non-representative system. But the fact is that set the agenda. It was in the public's mind, we're going to have marine reserves, and then they rezoned it very well. So my view is, okay, we didn't get what we want, but we'll get it in another 20 years' time. And it will be 20 years. I mean, I was starting to lobbying our federal minister, Robert Hill, to start this whole process in 1966. So, you know, we met the international conventions, unlike most other countries, but for me, that was 16 years, and that seems ridiculously slow. But now I'm older, I realise that 16 years is not slow, and I'll be 70 when they do the rezoning properly. There you go.
We'll have one more question, and then we can save the rest of it.
Okay, hi, my name is Terry Shore, Turtle Island Restoration Network. I really appreciated your presentation, and I really appreciated what you said about the marine networks that were created in Australia, because I think a lot of people over here get the idea that, you know, they are big, they are good, but they don't do really what I think people in Australia hope that they would do. And I've been over there quite a few times myself and helped fight off a major oil and gas proposal in the Kimberley. And so folks there are kind of fighting these projects off one by one, and there's a new campaign now that's just been initiated by a number of Australian NGOs for the Great Barrier Reef because of proposals for new coal ports, new LNG plants. It's mostly oil and gas, like you said. So my question to you is, how can you use your software to map out where these oil and gas projects overlap with really critical, not only habitat, but also migratory pathways and some of the other things that we're talking about? Can we use your tool to help push some of this back?
Great question, because that's what we've been doing with WWF for the last 4 months. So Carissa Klein, who was mentioned there, has a small project with them. It's a tiny project, $20,000. We're using Marxan. We know that they're going to put the ports in. We can't stop it. This is coal. This is the Australian economy, basically. And they're going to send it to China, whatever happens. So the ports are going to go in. We're using Marxan to put them into places that has the least impact, the least possible impact, and includes not only the destruction of habitat, but all the sediments and all those other runoff issues that we can stop, and also allow for us to pick land areas that will give us compensation. So can we get sugarcane areas out of production? Can we get people to reduce the fertiliser production in critical areas of the coast to again give the reef a bit of breathing space? And in fact, we've got a press release that's going out next week, and I'm the lead person on this. So other thing I do is 68 times last year I was doing a media story, and there's one on land clearing this week that I'm going to be answering phone calls, and next week there's a big one from WWF, which is a science consensus statement saying, guys, stop, you've got to think. And you know, it was very helpful that the World Heritage people said, you're going to lose your World Heritage status because you're stuffing this up. So yeah, there's a lot of good things going on, but it's a struggle. It's a struggle.
Just quick announcements. Sorry, it's so hot in here. We are trying to get the air on. It's harder to get people here during the weekend, but I think it should be on sometime soon. Okay.
Hi, so I am Phil McGillivary. I'm the science liaison for the Coast Guard for the Pacific area, and I'm also responsible for managing the icebreakers and science for them. We also do science on the buoy tenders, and we have a bunch of aircraft that we've been using for science as well. The Coast Guard does a lot more than people realize. My focus is generally on the polar regions, but I'm responsible for the whole Pacific. It's great to have Gregg here because I don't do law enforcement. I kind of work on the technology. And so what I wanted to talk about today is part of my responsibility, because the Coast Guard does manage the icebreakers for the Arctic and the Antarctic, is focused on trying to bring in more scientific data from those two areas. I have this job because I was sent to it by George Knox, who founded the United Nations Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research in 1953, and he called me up and said, I don't think we're getting enough data from Antarctica, can you help? And we're still not getting enough data from the polar regions. We take our ships there, but what I'm trying to do is develop some systems that are autonomous and networked to provide data for management of marine protected areas, for science and for law enforcement. So let's see, here we go. So what I'm talking about here is multiple vehicles. So multiple underwater vehicles, there's one shown on the surface down there, multiple surface vehicles, and multiple aircraft all at the same time. And we've been running these operations in Portugal with NATO funding, and I can legitimately say we have the most sophisticated system on the planet at this point. And now we're getting ready, it's been proven, to migrate it out to other areas. And the idea is that these systems will report back to manned ships and satellites. And in terms of what we're talking about for the networking, the key thing for networking is delay and disruption tolerant wireless networking. I've had the privilege of working with Vinton Cerf, who got the Presidential Medal for his work on the internet, and he developed this system for communicating to Mars for NASA. And I was like, Vin, we could probably use that down here. And so the good thing is that it's run through an internet engineering research group, and it's free. It's, so that you don't have to pay for this software, and we run it through a router hub on the ships usually, or on shore. And so it manages the communications from the underwater vehicles. You can see we have a wave divider here. These surface vessels manage the communications from the underwater vehicles and also from the aircraft. So we have everything networked together. This is really critical from a legal standpoint because if you can't control your autonomous vehicles, you're going to lose them and get in trouble. And so the DTN is really the critical basis for this networking. The other thing is that since it allows the aircraft, the surface vehicles, and the underwater vehicles to all communicate with each other and the people back on the ship to the shore, you can use adaptive sampling or anomaly mapping software, which has been developed by the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, and we have that software brought in here as well. So if you see something with an airplane, you can tell the surface vehicle to move over there and the underwater vehicle to move over there and get some data. And we have it set up so that it works without human input, but at any time you can take human control. So I mentioned this is about legal aspects as well. And again, I want to thank Meg and Larry for organizing this symposium. So there is this thing called SARAMS in Europe, which is the Safety and Regulations for Unmanned Maritime Systems. And I'm like one of the only Americans on the whole committee because they don't really like Americans that much over there. And they have this issue where if you lose an autonomous vehicle in Italy, it's over in France in 5 minutes or in Monaco or something. So they're actually really concerned about getting some legal stuff going. And they're a little bit ahead of us on that. I'm also on the FAA committees for unmanned aircraft. And we are working through that. We have permission now to fly unmanned aircraft in Alaska for the first time this year to set a protocol for the rest of the United States, which is because we got Senator Begich to put in the FAA budget that they had to do it this year. So that's one way of getting stuff done. The problem is they went off on this hysterical thing about privacy, and we really are trying to get them, this is an interagency government group, to focus on government use in maritime areas. We're not looking for Lindsay Lohan in her backyard. And they really get hung up on that, and FAA has no right to regulate privacy, so we backed them away from that, and we're moving forward with them. It's just slow. If you're using autonomous systems, you are going to detect military vehicles. And so you have to work with the military to remove the submarines and remove the ships or whatever else. And a classic example of that is Neptune Observatory in Canada has real-time reporting from their hydrophones, and they just run everything through the Navy, and in less than 5 to 7 minutes, the Navy takes out the subs, and then they send it to the Canadian Navy, and they rubber stamp it, and then the data goes out on the internet. So there's a little bit of a delay there before you can put it up on the web, but we know how to handle that. I worked at Fleet Numerical in Monterey. We know how to do that, know how to do that. So that has to be in there, though. And then the other issue for legal stuff is this issue of, oh, your autonomous surface vehicle ran into my boat, or your autonomous underwater vehicle ran into my diver while he was cleaning my hull. These are issues that I'm going to let Greg talk about a little bit, because that's not my area of expertise. So this gets to the whole safety of life at sea. Roger's here. Roger had his wave glider run over in Monterey Bay. But fortunately, the wave glider got the worst end of that, I think. But these are issues that are some of the legal issues. And the other issue that we worry about is the international issue. Okay, you lost it. Well, immediately, if you're sending something with acoustic sensors and it goes across the maritime boundary line of the Bering Sea, it's in Russian waters and they think you're spying. And on the other hand, if you have an autonomous surface vehicle or underwater vehicle from Scripps, most likely, off the port of LA or Long Beach, somebody at some point is going to get a little bit excited about that and think you're a terrorist. And these are sort of unresolved issues. Ironically, of all the people most likely to lose autonomous vehicles in foreign waters, the US Navy is probably at the top of the list. They haven't done that much, but we have had incidents like this already. So getting back to the legal, how do you deal with these legal concerns? I'm very concerned about surveillance for science and also for maritime law enforcement. And why? The key thing for me is persistence. If you have a vessel that's out there illegally dumping oil, that doesn't take 20 minutes. Unless you happen to have a satellite over the top of it taking a very high resolution picture, it's not going to do you any good. I really need persistent surveillance. That's a key Homeland Security funded project that I'm involved with. The ideal way to do this is with, I have the whole Pacific, that's my backyard. You can't see that from a little unmanned aircraft. You really need a high level one. And so the idea is to partner that and have the high level one send to Intel and tell the low level one where to go. So we're working on that now. I'm going to talk about that. Satellite stuff is great, but because of the lack of temporal stuff, it really doesn't provide what you need for these lawsuits. So one of our goals is, again, like I said, to capture short-lived environmental events. Fronts and eddies move around a lot. Runoff events from land only take a day or two. You can't get a ship or sampling stuff out there. You need to be able to respond to these short-lived events from an ecological basis and also from a law enforcement basis. Another goal for me is to get the legal case against illegal fishing. And if you can do that, and if you can start arresting people at the dock, we have a continuous record of you illegally fishing, we're just going to bust you at the dock. That's versus chasing them at sea. This is not to say that we don't sometimes need to chase people at sea, but we're in an era of declining budgets right now in the US. We really need to try and come up with another protocol. And the other thing is make this whole surveillance capability, persistent surveillance capability, very much online, very much visible, and then the idea is to increase deterrence. As Gregg said, not having them do bad things and not having to chase them is much cheaper. Right now, this surveillance is spotty, so it's all classified. We don't talk about like how much we do. We know that the interdictions are maybe 20%. It doesn't even matter what that number is. It's not high enough. I tell people if we started busting 50% of the illegal fishing vessels every year, it would stop. But we're not there yet. So we have a limited deterrent effect. And then we have this higher cost. And we really need to bring the cost down because all of these marine protected areas in waters outside the United States, they don't have the financial resources to put into this the way the US does, and even our budget is decreasing. So how do we get there? The medium and high altitude, which are called MAIL and HAIL programs for long endurance, we now have aircraft that will stay up for more than a month. So a lot of my life is worrying about how to get them to land and take off from ships. If they're up there for a month, I don't even actually need to do that anymore. Now we just have to deal with the legal status of unmanned aircraft operations. DARPA has this program for the Vulture that's going to stay up there for a long time. Boeing is pursuing it independently. They have another communication node program for, by the way, high altitude would be like 60,000 feet, and then mid-altitude is lower than that. So we have these things happening in the next year or so. In the meantime, for the smaller unmanned aircraft, laser motive, there's a couple of ways of keeping those up there by recharging them. We have a demonstration for NOAA, the Navy, Coast Guard, Homeland Security with laser motive. They just put a solar panel on the bottom of their little unmanned airplane and just beam a laser up at it. So you have two airplanes. One of them is out flying around, and the other one is just hovering over this thing getting recharged, and then they switch places. So there are these technologies that are coming online that I think will help us with this problem. Meantime, we have these other technologies, Arabelle flex rotor. So one of the problems is we have a problem with getting the things off the ships, and we use ships. I'm a ship person. So it's a pain to launch them and land them. You don't have a landing strip on your ship. So you have to catch them in nets, and it's kind of a pain. This Arabelle flex rotor takes off vertically, goes horizontal, and then it reverses itself and it lands in this thing like a cone. It just kind of settles into one of these cone notches. So that's one method. That's being tested now. The Navy has developed this stop rotor, what do they call it? Yeah, stop rotor unmanned aircraft. Again, small thing, takes off like a helicopter, then fixes and flies. This gets away from the problem of launching and retrieving from ships. So what are the science issues that we're dealing with here? I have the usual thing, like I said, monitoring in space and time for short-lived events. We have oil spill pollution, noise pollution, also harmful algal blooms, and species interdictions. Disease organisms is a big deal, including in aquaculture as well as in humans. Ocean acidification, I'll talk about. Illegal fishing, climate change, and temperature changes, coral bleaching. Ice is my thing. We have shipping stuff that we need to monitor. And then basically your basic things for primary productivity, oxygen minima, and whale ship collision avoidance, which I'm very focused on. And then the other two issues, I'm going to talk about these very briefly. Data communications. Okay, you're getting me HD video from an unmanned aircraft coming in 24/7. How do you manage that? And then how do you display the data for people so they can use it? So this is just to show you that we have these issues here. And I'm really focused in this part here in the middle about fronts and eddies. Those are the parts that are sort of hard to catch up with. That's where your oil spill events happen also. Well, what have we been doing? Well, we set up a program to fly the Raven, this is our Raven unmanned aircraft up here, just to monitor ice ridges. I can show you some other pictures about how much fuel and time we saved by not going through ice ridges with the ship, which we don't like to do. And then this is mapping in Antarctica. One of the other things that's sort of interesting is that we work, in our case, with a whole bunch of ice seals that their critical habitat depends on the nature of the ice. Some of the seals require really ridged ice. You can't get ice ridging from a satellite. So the only way to actually get the habitat for these things mapped correctly is with these unmanned aircrafts. And here's an example of this mapping. This is a quad rotor that was used with our icebreaker, the Healy, in Nome, and they were trying to get the fuel from a Russian ship into Nome's harbor. This is the harbor here, but it had all these ice ridges. And so they just programmed in a bunch of waypoints for the thing, and they mapped out where all the ice ridges were and figured out how to get the oil into Nome. This is a picture of some of the other systems that we're using. This is a solar ship from Gabe Elkheim at UC Santa Cruz. This, of course, is the surveillance wave glider. I like that one because that one's red. But you can see the surveillance camera in the back, and we tested this out in Hawaii, and it works fine. You can actually see illegal fishing boats. And hopefully, since it's red, they won't run over that one. This is another vehicle that is not yet unmanned, but this is the Wave Adaptive Modular Vehicle that's made out here in Berkeley, actually. It comes in a smaller version that we've worked out than this one. And that's being made autonomous. And this is an autonomous underwater vehicle that the military uses out of Scripps, which I really would like to get to Antarctica to go underneath the Ross ice shelf. Has a very unusual propulsion system, which is a steel ball that's magnetically controlled, and the thing just goes in a sine wave. And you can also make it turn left or right. It'll go 1,000 kilometers. It has no motor. And the Navy did that because it's very quiet. So it could be used for things also. This is a picture of, well, for whale detection is what I was thinking of there, and ship detection for illegal fishing in areas that are not used, which is a big question about how do you detect illegal fishing with noise, and what's the range, and that's one of the goals of our project for Homeland Security, hopefully this summer, which I'm meeting on next week. So this is a wave glider that has the NOAA PMEL ocean acidification system that was developed for buoys. We kind of thought that was a little awkward, so we made it much smaller with some grants from Google Foundation and working at McGillivary. And so this is a map of ocean acidification that McGillivary made using the smaller version of this. So you can use these vehicles. We have a goal, I have a goal personally, of trying to get ocean acidification measurements made on a regular basis in every single marine protected area, which includes doing it in places where there are fronts and things moving around, not just at some fixed location, which is the current NOAA plan, which is great, but you need to be able to monitor these other events and then go back to calibrate the NOAA fixed sites. So I mentioned that there are these other issues, so this is a repeated one. And we are focused now, also you can use the wave gliders and other things to listen for whales, and we're really trying to do that. And I'm going to focus on these other issues here, the data issues now. So I've already mentioned that you have to have delay and disruption tolerant communications. That's essential. And then you have this big deal. You have the video, which is streaming in, and what do you do with it? Well, the first thing is if you have video and you want to bust somebody for illegal fishing, you better have it geo-referenced. And that doesn't just fall off a shelf. You actually have to put something in place to do that. And so the first thing, and then you have to actually, in our case, on my icebreakers, you have to ingest the video data, you have to archive it, and then it has to be searchable. So what we're trying to do, most of the FBI and the CIA and the National Geospatial Data Associations, they use this software that was developed at Google called Hadoop. And Hadoop allows you to do all of this, and Google has the capability of actually taking all your data and storing it. So I've now been authorized by the National Science Foundation to try and get this on both Navy ships, I've also the Navy, to get this used on Navy ships. Right now what happens is even on the Navy ships with their drones, the drones send all the data back to DC. They don't come to the ship. They're not incorporated into the bridge of the ship. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do, is get this better incorporated. And it has the advantage, if you use that, that's what everybody else is already using. You can just dump it directly in the National Geospatial data set, and it works with the software they already have. But I mentioned that we have this challenge that the data is very high bandwidth. And right now, most of the data is being transmitted underwater acoustically. Well, that's not exactly HD video bandwidth. So we have this laser. This is a laser communication system that was built at Harbor Branch with money from the Navy. And it's omnidirectional, which is pretty important. You know, all you have to find where to point it. And look at the bandwidth there, 20 megabytes per second. You can also send multi-beam maps of the seafloor for archaeological sites, or in my case, the underside of the ice to find out where the oil is. Underneath the ice, we should have an oil spill in Alaska before too long and find out we may need that. So I'm trying to get these optical communication systems out there to increase the bandwidth of communications from the autonomous systems. And I expect we'll be making a great deal of progress on that. And next year, I already have the agreements for that. And then getting back to the policy issues, these are the policy issues that I worry about from my perspective on how do we get the science for the Coast Guard in the country and bring protected areas out there. Gray water disposal, like I said, dumping of oily waste. The whole issue of noise around harbors and black carbon in the Arctic is a big issue. The whale collision avoidance issue has been on the top of my list for a long time now, and we're also worried about these new ports in the Arctic for alien species introduction, because there haven't been You know, we're building a new port in the Arctic. How are we going to monitor alien species introduction? That has been not the best organized effort in the country to date, let's just say. And if we're building a new port in the Arctic, which is going to have ships from all over, we probably need to figure that out. The hope that because it's cold, things won't settle there, they've already found out that doesn't work. They already have some problems. So the other policy issues for the Arctic are search and rescue, very important, and pollution response. We know that cruise ships have a 50% probability in 10 years of having a breakdown. That's their data. So we're trying to get the cruise ships to follow each other, and this gets to the escort part of that. And so the other policies in the Arctic, of course, are fishing. Yeah, it's supposedly not happening in US waters, but what about the rest of the Arctic? And then this whole issue of how do you do the navigation up there, and how do you certify people to operate in the ice, and then what do you do about nuclear ships and the nuclear waste that's in the Arctic, which there's a great deal of. President Wootton is trying to actually deal with that issue now, to his credit. But they have a lot to deal with, and there's some very large radiation waste areas up there. For marine protected areas, the policy issues are basically, again, persistent surveillance and monitoring. How do you use that for management? And then these issues of climate change, like I said, measuring ocean acidification being a classic example that I think should be incorporated into the management of every marine protected area, but we need to start measuring it and come up with a system that's effective for doing that, and also for looking at runoff and pollutants. Great Barrier Reef, this is one of their key issues that they're having problems with, not just from poor land management, but from the fires that are resulting in Australia from changes in the climate, and we're having the same issues in Alaska. Massive forest fires, massive runoff. And so for fisheries, again, same issue, how do we manage the fisheries? And the last thing, which is very important to me, and I'm sort of the native peoples person for Homeland Security, for Alaska Fishing, Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, the Walrus Commission. I work with the native peoples in Hawaii and Samoa to deconflict things. The native peoples have rights. Their subsistence rights in Alaska are a very big deal to them, and we haven't necessarily dealt with that as well as we need to on a national basis. Oops, let's see, hold on. Oh, I screwed up somehow. Just a second. I had the last slide. We'll get to it maybe. Oh, there we go, conclusions. There we go. I don't know how to make it full screen again, so I'm not going to press that. Maybe. No. So anyway, what I was talking about is, thank you. Make it full screen. I told you I was going to do this. So what we need is we still need to figure out how do we ingest the data. We're going to be getting, the goal is to get more persistent data, but that's a lot of data. What do you do with it? Well, the goal is maybe to get Hadoop used. And then we need to have it made available to managers. The guy's driving the ship, he doesn't want to have to think about stuff. He just wants to know where are the ice ridges, where are the whales I'm supposed to avoid, where's the oil spill I'm supposed to go investigate, make it easy for me. And then I think part of that is we need to have this issue of the optical communications to handle the high width bandwidth data coming back from these autonomous systems and include the issue of scrubbing the data for the military. We do need some more and smaller sensors, the ability to take that very large waveguide erosion acidification system and shrink it down to, I don't know, 20% the size, I guess, much smaller. We need that for some of the other sensors for the unmanned aircraft. We also, I was on a phone conference earlier in the week, and the legal people from the National Science Foundation were like, well, we have to have a training program, you know, for these unmanned aircraft operations. And I'm like, yeah, I'll get to that. I'm working on that. First, we're doing the safety standards. Then we're going to get the training program in place as part of that. They do require training programs. And so that has to be considered a component of something we still need. And then I always have to ping on this. You'll see the word demonstration in each one of these. I need to have demonstration projects. I need to have a means of demonstrating the use of this new technology. I need to demonstrate its cost effectiveness for just science and for law enforcement, because, you know, Coast Guard headquarters isn't going to believe me that it's more cost effective if I can't do some demonstrations projects. Fortunately, they're now starting to give us a little bit of money to do that, and that's coming in part from Homeland Security. And so we also need to show these about how they can maintain subsistence rights. I need to be able to demonstrate how autonomous technologies can assist with subsistence rights. Those people are asking me to do this, and I don't have the ability to do that right now. And subsistence rights, for example, would be monitoring where the whale populations are, where whaling is, and making sure that foreign vessels and US vessels don't interfere with whaling. That's a question that's on my table every day, and especially right now. Whaling just ended at St. Lawrence Island. And then we really are also going to need this for disaster scenarios, whether they're oil spills or Hurricane Sandy sort of a thing. And let me remind you that when Hurricane Katrina hit, the first thing that happened was all the ports were full of debris and they couldn't get the boats in and out. Well, we had to have special boats to go in and try and get around the debris and map where the debris was. You could very easily do that with an autonomous system. So we need to be ready to have the data systems and management in place to handle these sorts of demonstrations. So that's what I was going to talk about today. I have no idea how I get on time. So.
We can take one question if anyone has a question they want to ask now.
Just a little technical question. I know that they're unmanned, but do you have people that are choosing the places where the devices are going, or are they just out there until they run out of juice, or how does that go?
It depends on what you're trying to do is the question. And we definitely picked a place. The demonstration project for maritime law enforcement will be near Hawaii because that was kind of cheap, but as soon as we actually show how it's going to work, the place to send it is the most problematic place for us in terms of time and cost, and that's the seamounts off the northern Marianas Islands, where we have a lot of illegal fishing, and it costs the Coast Guard a fortune to send planes out there from Honolulu. So that's a time and place cost for law enforcement issues where we're trying to focus. For science issues in Monterey Bay and elsewhere, and also Alaska, one of the issues is that most of the biology happens at the fronts. So that's where you want to go. Most of the air-sea flux of CO2 happens at the fronts. But if you have an oil spill, that's also where the oil aggregates. So we're trying to train unmanned aircraft to look at the fronts and then tell the other systems where to go get them. We've already done one experiment like that in Monterey Bay. And the sort of problem that I didn't talk about too much is that if you tell an autonomous underwater vehicle, go find me a front, by the time it finds the front, it will have used up all of its battery power. So we demonstrated already a few months ago, I guess March. It really works really great if you have the unmanned aircraft. Tell the autonomous vehicle, hey, I found the front, it's over here, you don't have to look around. Because then it can go there, and you've increased literally 80% what its battery lifetime is, sampling the environment that you want. And so this was another big deal with the Gulf of Mexico Deepwater Horizon oil spill. It's like we used airplanes to look where the oil was, but they couldn't measure, this is why I talked about sensor stuff, they couldn't measure the oil thickness. So the Coast Guard wasted quite a lot of time and money sending assets to what turned out to be an oil sheen when the really thick oil, which looked like from above the same thing, was in a different place. And so we are working really hard to try and get some of these multispectral systems to be able to respond in that manner and communicate. So, okay.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Caldwell and Stanford University for allowing me to be a presenter and participate in this seminar. It is outside of what the normal type of a group that I engage in, but it's a real privilege, and it's been really quite interesting, and it's certainly giving me a lot of food for thought in terms of my industry, which has traditionally been, maritime-related international litigation. And timely, I also want to thank Roger Hine and Liquid Robotics. As you know, I serve on their strategic advisory board. That was announced earlier. But the real brains behind the operation and the person that I think in many respects all of us who are involved and care about marine conservation need to thank more than anyone is Roger Hine and Liquid Robotics. So if you join me. What I'm going to be talking about, and when I was contacted by Stanford to come up and talk to this symposium, was about what is marine conservation or dynamic marine conservation from the standpoint of a maritime lawyer. And there were a lot of directions that I could have gone with that. I also, by the way, want to thank all of the other speakers for giving me this slot, because a lot of people were battling for this last slot, but I got it. And the reason that that's great for me, actually, is because I have in this topic what I've decided to talk about with respect to unmanned marine vehicles is what is their legal status. And I'm going to do that, and I'm going to keep you awake. I promise you're not going to fall asleep, because I'm going to talk about two of the primary reflections on human nature, because we've talked a lot about human nature. And so it's the rule of the two P's. The two important parts of human nature that you're going to hear about during this talk are poetry and pornography. And if you don't think that I can link those up to unmanned vessels, you're wrong, because I'm going to do it. So first of all, I'm going to talk to you a little bit of poetry to start out and to sort of set the stage for this. One of my favorite poets of all time was the English poet laureate John Masefield, who was the poet laureate in England from 1930 until he died, I believe, in 1967. One of his famous poems is Sea Fever. And I won't sing it to you because I don't have Ilani's voice, but I will tell you that it starts out, I must go down to the sea again, to the lonely sea and sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. Why is that relevant? Because the relevance is that the question before us today is, do we go down to the sea in a tall ship like HMS Beagle, or do we go down to the sea in something like you see here, one of these autonomous or unmanned marine vehicles in terms of our science? Which button do I push here? That's it. Let's see. There we go. So, you know, when we were growing up, we all kind of knew, or we thought we knew, what was a marine vessel. And these are pictures of what we traditionally understand to be a vessel. You've got container ships, you've got tug ships, you've got sailboats, you've got, you know, fishing boats. Those are vessels. We all understand it. And if you see my comment there, and the lawyers in the room may already know where I'm going with this, you saw a vessel, you knew it when you saw it. But maybe you didn't. And so what we're going to be talking about today are three different types of vehicles. And the question presented, and these are something that the U.S. Supreme Court has dealt with, is the question, are these vessels? And I'll come at the end to the discussion of why does it matter, particularly when we're talking about unmanned marine vehicles. First of all, this was one option, is Stewart versus Dutra Construction. It was a Supreme Court decision in 2005. And the second decision I'm going to talk about is one that just came out this year, Lozman versus City of Riviera Beach, Florida. And the question presented in each of these cases, the same thing. Is this a vessel? Well, do you know it when you see it? Stewart versus Dutra involved a vessel called, or an item, I'll say, called the Super Scoop. The Super Scoop at the time was the largest dredging vehicle in the world. It could dredge a channel 30 feet wide and 50 feet deep. It had a crew, a captain, lights, crew quarters, dining areas, limited means of self-propulsion, and it could be towed into locations by use of tugs. In fact, it was moved from the U.S. West Coast to do the Big Dig project in Boston Harbor, and moved there by tugs. Once it was in place, it could also use its own anchors and windlasses and things to pull itself along. It might move 30 to 50 feet each time that it made a move. Well, the U.S. District Court looked at that and it said, that's not a vessel. And the reason that they said it wasn't a vessel is because under what was then known as the primary purpose or primary function test, this item was deemed to be primarily used for dredging, not navigation. The Court of Appeals upheld that decision, and again focusing on the primary purpose rule, and also noted that any navigation or transport was incidental to that primary purpose. What did the Supreme Court decide? The Supreme Court said it's a vessel. May not look like a vessel, but if the Supreme Court went back to something that you really need to be familiar with, and that is the Rules of Construction Act, and in 1 U.S.C. Section 3, they define a vessel. And it says the word vessel includes every description of watercraft or artificial contrivance used or capable of being used as a means of transportation on water. And the Supreme Court really focused on that capable of being used. And what the Supreme Court said, it's not only capable of being used for marine transportation, it is engaged in marine transportation because it has aboard it a crew and equipment that is being transported and used in its operations. So they really focused on, well, is it capable? And they said, for capable, though, we need to focus on practical, not theoretical transportation. So they found that it was actually practically and actually engaged in transportation. So everybody thought, well, geez, that's a great decision. We understand it now. We kind of get rid of this primary function or primary purpose rule that we've been operating as maritime lawyers. I guess we had it wrong for, I don't know, about 100 years. But, you know, we now have a rule. And then came along the Lozman decision. So we thought we knew what was a vessel, but Lozman presented us with a new problem. And Lozman was a houseboat. And it sat on an empty bilge space so it could float. It had some living quarters aboard it. But also it didn't have any watertight compartments. It didn't have, you know, portholes. It had, literally it had French doors to walk outside. And it could also, like the dredge we just saw, it could be towed short distances, and it could be moved by tugs, and was once moved by tugs, about 200 miles actually. But it could be moved shorter distances, also using tugs. There were a lot of analogies to the earlier decision in Stewart. So the U.S. District Court, Stewart, it's a vessel. The Court of Appeals, it's a vessel. And the Court of Appeals applied the term capable broadly and noted that the structure could float, proceed under tow. It had short connections, but they would be disconnected, so it could be moved. So this went up to the Supreme Court. What did the Supreme Court say? You know it when you see it. It's not a vessel. Come on, give me a break. The word vessel, again, it goes back to that one definition in 1 U.S.C. Section 3, and they focus not just this time on the practical capability of being used for transportation. They focused on what is transportation. And transportation, according to the Supreme Court, means that you are moving or carrying people or things over water. And what the Supreme Court said is, that is not really capable of moving things over water. It's not what it's designed for. And so the Supreme Court said, one is a vessel, one is not a vessel. Let me just go, I go back to this screen because I actually made a promise to you, and I don't want to forget. I told you I would talk about pornography. So in a case that goes back to 1967 in Jacobellis versus Ohio, Justice Stewart was addressing the question of what constitutes pornography, because pornography was not going to be considered protected under the First Amendment rights, but you still had freedom of speech. And he addressed the question of what is pornography. He came up with one of the most famous quotes in constitutional law, which is that, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And this isn't it. And that was his quote in the Jacobellis versus Ohio decision. Now, just in case you think that I'm kind of crazy and I just wanted to talk about sex, which, you know, sometimes I do, but not today. The reality is, the reason I bring up the Jacobellis decision and the I know it when I see it provision, or holding in Stewart's, actually is in his concurring opinion, is that the Supreme Court came up with a new test. They expanded on the test in Stewart versus Dutra, and they said, you know what? A vessel is it, they put it in the negative, a structure does not fall within the scope of the statutory phrase unless a reasonable observer looking at the home's physical characteristics and activities would consider it designed to a practical degree for carrying people or things over water. It became, in a respect, a jury question. Although there have been some district courts that have now taken this and said that no reasonable juror could conclude that something was a particular vessel. So it is kind of a mixed question of law and fact. But the reason that I bring up that decision, Jacobells versus Ohio, is because that is exactly what Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent in the Lozman decision, referred to. She said, you know, this test of the reasonable observer determining whether something is a vessel or not strikes me to be a lot like Justice Stewart's concurring opinion of, I know it when I see it. But that's where the Supreme Court, as of January, has left us in terms of what is a vessel. One's a vessel, one's not. So why am I bringing this up? The question now presented is, are these things that we're going down to the sea in and gathering data as scientists? You're involved in dynamic marine conservation. Dynamic is not just in talking about the tools that you have that you've used in terms of the logarithms that we talked about, that Hugh talked about, or considerations of culture, or mapping and those things. It's also about the tools that you use in your dynamic marine conservation program. And I think it's important for you, yeah, that's not going to happen, in your dynamic marine conservation program. She gave me 1 minute left to speak. I'm not going to be able to wrap it up. But basically, if you look at these vessel-like characteristics as, of an unmanned marine vehicle, you have that it can float, it's hydrodynamic, it's capable of self-propulsion, and it can have missions similar to those of traditional vessels. But on the other hand, they don't carry people. They're not used for the transportation of things over water, as the Supreme Court said. And they're very small in size. They're not what we traditionally look at as a vessel. And in fact, the U.S. Coast Guard minimum size for a regulated vessel is 5 tons. So you're talking about very small unmanned vehicles. I put up here a question about, well, could somebody argue that, wait a minute, they've got scientific instruments aboard, or they're towing an array or something like that. Isn't that cargo? They're gathering data. And the answer is that under U.S. law, if we do analogize it to a vessel, those things are considered to be appurtenances to the vessel. Appurtenances have been found to be electronics. Anything that's required for the navigation and functioning of the vessel isn't cargo, it's actually part of the vessel itself. So similarly, these things, the electronic data, is in one person's view, the reasonable observer's view, my children might disagree with me, but the reasonable observer's view could be simply appurtenances to the structure. So we go back to the USC definition, the reasonable observer. Why does this matter? I'm really getting close, I promise you. Well, the reason that this matters is because there's a whole bunch of laws, both national and international laws, that relate to or are defined in terms of their application to a vessel. And we heard about, Alani mentioned today, the right to pass through a marine protected area was defined in terms of vessels going through that. But we also have the Federal Maritime Lien Act. We have the Longshore and Harbor Workers' Compensation Act, Ship Mortgage Act, Limitation of Liability Act, and the International Collision Regulations. All of those talk in terms of what is a vessel. If you take this structure ashore and it gets work done, is it subject to a maritime lien? If it's a vessel, yes. If it's not a vessel, no. Can you go out, if you want to buy one, can you get a preferred ship mortgage? If it's a vessel, yes. If it's not a vessel, no. So all of these limitation of liability. It gets in an accident. If it's a vessel, you can limit your liability to the value of the thing that's left. You crush one of these, you know, can you sue? Yeah, you can sue. You get the value that's left over of that structure, whatever it happens to be. It may be trash. So those are the reasons why this is important. And the coal regs are probably one of the most important. The coal regs, the international, let's try to emphasize international collision regulations, which actually define a vessel very, very similarly to 1 U.S.C. Section 3, says it applies to vessels that are on the high seas. Now, they define different classes of vessels, which I've listed up here. But as you can see, an autonomous or unmanned vehicle really doesn't fit most of these definitions. So why would you make a unmanned vehicle comply with rules that require you, for example, to have lights, sound, lookouts, AIS systems, use of a code flag, a 1 meter tall flag if you're in a zone of limited, or if you're operating as a vessel of limited navigability. And the reason I put that up there is there's actually a proposal by the U.S. Coast Guard Navigation Safety Committee to actually regulate some unmanned vehicles as vessels. So it matters. So ultimately my conclusion is status is they're currently undefined. They're either vessels or they're undefined. It's up to the reasonable observer to consider whether these vessels are designed, or vehicles are designed to a practical degree for carrying people or things over water. You, ladies and gentlemen, are the reasonable observers. It's up to you. If they are vessels, they may be subject to a wide range of laws. And if they're not, then the question becomes, under national and international law, what are they? That's how I conclude it, but I have one more poem I want to share with you, and the reason is because I think it's a good way, as the last speaker, I'm using my artistic license to go just a second over, because I want to sum up what I think has happened here and why I'm so encouraged by being here. And there was a poem that hung in my home when I was growing up. My parents had on the wall, and fortunately my father and my mother made a copy for me, and it actually hangs in my wall in my bedroom. I look at it every day. And it's an unnamed poem by an anonymous author. And it says, "One ship goes east, another west, by the self-same winds that blow. 'Tis the set of the sail and not the gale that determines the way they go. Like the wind, like the ships at sea are the waves of fate as we voyage along through life. 'Tis the set of the soul that decides the goal, and not the calm nor strife." And what we've heard about over the last 2 days is a lot about the strife, about the problems that we encounter in dynamic marine conservation. But at the same time, it is so apparent in hearing the topic and hearing the discussions and the questions and presentations from people like Alani, yours in particular, and your singing, that really bring out that the soul of the people in this conference, in this symposium, is so set on achieving their goal that no matter what the calm nor strife, I believe you will achieve your goal. So thank you for letting me participate.
Go ahead and open up to the panel discussion. All of our speakers want to come join us at the front.
We need another chair.
No questions, fantastic.
Game, the Nature Conservancy, I want to get Hugh to comment on other circumstances that led to the success of the Great Barrier Reef, and I guess in the spirit of a dynamic environment, that the government of Australia created one single body to manage many, many agencies, had complete authority over fishing, over mining even over agricultural practices. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, how essential is that to creating these units at the scale of the management you're doing? How essential is that to the success?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority is an unusual agency that has had already this large authority. And of course it's an unreplicated experiment, so in a sense they succeeded. Does that mean that's the only way to succeed? Well, no, other places have succeeded. Is it going to help you succeed? Probably. And certainly in some regions, Karen Eddivane, when we were discussing South Australia's marine protected area system, which still hasn't been dedicated after 15 years of lobbying and work, she said in her first attempts to do that, she said, let's call the whole thing a marine protected area, but put in no protection, if you know what I mean. Just call it all some sort of zone and put an authority in charge of it. And if we don't get a no-take area or any sort of thing, just do that first. So her view was that that's a clever mechanism for progress. But I don't know many other organisations that have done it like that.
Jeff Ardron, IASS. You know, it's cooler down here. I was sitting, it's actually cooler. I feel, I'm sure there's a scientific principle at work. So I was trying to think what could tie together this discussion on monitoring, control, surveillance options. And to my mind, it's data, surveillance data as well as science data. We know that using programs like MarkSan, setting the cost functions or whatever, it's almost impossible because we can't get a hold of the human use data, at least in the ocean. And then I hear Phil's, it's always great listening to Phil because it's just like 100,000 different ideas coming out, and I can see, of those, a few are going to take root, and a few data streams will start to happen, and I don't expect right away, but is there a possibility down the road that these data streams can start to become publicly available, so that we can actually start to, as independent researchers, rather than simply government agencies, as society at large, start to do the kind of planning that we've been discussing in the panel. So I guess I have two questions. The one that you just heard to Phil, and then for Hugh, how you feel that such data could change the way that we do conservation planning.
So I have a relatively easy answer for the first one, which is that, as I mentioned, and as you're well aware, I believe that the deterrence effect will be greatly enhanced by making the information available on Google Oceans. And the other thing that I'd like to say is that Google has made a $5 million grant to a group, which I can never remember the name of, but it's like Conservation Airplanes or something like that, which is for unmanned aircraft operations for conservation. And I'm already working with them. I'm one of the first people they called when they got the money. And they do white rhinos and orangutans and some other stuff. And because I work with Google Oceans, Sylvia Earle picked up the phone and said, it's all terrestrial. Are you going to fund some stuff for the oceans? And so, Google Foundation is not the most adept and rapid moving organization on the planet, having dealt with them, but they do fund things. And so I think that, like anything else, this will be a stepwise approach, and probably these NGOs and foundations that have money are going to realize that, yeah, it's great to be saving the white rhino, but we actually need this data to be made available for the oceans. And I can tell you that the pressure has already been put out for that. And we are already working on animal tags that report directly to the unmanned aircraft, and that was part of what we were doing with the funds that came from the Google Foundation. So I think that that will probably get done. Like everything else, it'll be a while, but it'll be public when it happens, and that's part of the whole effort.
The human use data will be extremely useful, just because in some cases people lie. So you can ask recreational fishers where they go fishing, and actually, even though the software then tries to avoid the places where they fished, they think you're going to deliberately go out of your way to make a marine reserve where they fish. And so that's odd, perverse sort of behaviour. So having independent data about where people would be extremely useful.
I forgot to add, I did have this in there, but the issue of the privacy thing. So there was the Autonomous Vehicle, AUVSI, Autonomous Vehicle Association, or whatever it's called. I can never remember the acronyms. But they actually, when the FAA said, oh, we're going to need 5 years to come up with regulations, that's what they said, 5 years to write up the regulations for privacy for unmanned aircraft. The AUVSI lobbyists, which I'm a member of, went back and immediately said, you have no purview under FAA for privacy regulations. There are already privacy regulations. And let's just deal with it as it comes up. And particularly, I mean, this really does drive me nuts, is we're only talking in our case about unmanned aircraft operations over the ocean. And we're talking about this for government agencies using them for things like search and rescue and oil spills and stuff. So, and FAA is still very difficult to work with, but we are working with them, and I think that we're going to get this done. But if you think that the privacy issue is not going to come up in releasing some of this data, it is going to come up. But by doing things like, you know, one of the things I'm trying to deal with is this monitoring of dugongs, which we know are not well monitored by aircraft. Because when you monitor them from unmanned aircraft, if you monitor them from boats or aircraft, you'll see a dugong here and a dugong there. If you monitor them with unmanned aircraft, which has been done by the people in Australia, you'll see them having a big party at the Howard Johnsons, and there's 80 of them in one picture. And you never see that with any other kind of monitoring. So that's kind of where and this is a very critical issue. Someone mentioned the issue of migration routes. Well, that's the whole thing. They're migrating through that oil and gas development off northwest Australia, and there's no protection for them right now. And you can't send people out with manned vessels to get the data on them because they go away as soon as they even almost hear a vessel. So the idea will be to use some of these data for that kind of thing, not looking at Lindsay Lohan on the back of a yacht, and then get the uses established for oil spills and other issues where we need them first. And I think we're going to work stepwise on it. That's my answer to that question.
Sarah Maxwell, Stanford University. I had a question that kind of ties in a little bit what we were talking about yesterday in terms of hotspots, both biological and also human use when we talk about that. I was wondering if, particularly for the folks that are working in enforcement, whether or not you get the data that you need in order to prioritize where to enforce when we're talking about the scale of an EEZ or when we're talking about a really large-scale MPA and that sort of thing. Because it seems like it'd be really critical not just to know, okay, here's the habitat range of a seabird, but to know where's the core area. And if there's 4 core areas, which of those is more important? Because you're really probably only going to be able to actively enforce certain, a few of those places. And so I was just curious if you get that data and whether or not, if there's anything that we as scientists, managers can do to facilitate that process. And I was also curious for Hugh whether or not you're aware of any applications. Oh, you're only allowed one. Oh. Hey, he got 2. Okay, I'll stop there.
Well, I will let Greg answer that because he gets the data, I don't.
Thank you. So I think the short answer to your question is no. I think there's obviously a much longer question. And I think it's a matter of timeliness of the information. Now, having long-term trends to help me do long-term planning and scheduling is very valuable. So I can know that it's more important for me to have a ship in a certain location in March than it is in May. And then I can plan my ship schedules around that and actually place them in where the activity is most likely to occur. Mm-hmm. Now, is there information that could be made available in real time? Electronic logbooks, VMS data, some of those pieces, some of those things we do get now, and then we do use them to great effect. Mm-hmm. But some of the scientific data, the process that scientific data goes through to get to the point that you feel comfortable with it being in the public realm, I don't need that level of certainty. That's not what I need. Mm-hmm. I'm willing to work off of a hunch. I'm willing to work off of, this is my best guess, and I understand that it couldn't be peer reviewed, but yeah. I can work with that. And so, in the nature of keeping it short. And
thank you.
Last 2 questions right here.
Hi, Kelsey Jacobson from Congresswoman Lois Capps' office. I have a question that's specific to ocean acidification, although I think it would probably have a lot of analogs in other monitoring spheres. And I think this question is probably mostly for Philip. I am very happy to hear about the good work that the Coast Guard is doing on ocean acidification monitoring, and I've heard about other monitoring efforts that are happening in other U.S. agencies. The EPA might do a little bit more. The Army Corps is doing some. Of course, NOAA has their ocean acidification branch. And I was wondering if I could get your perspective on the amount of collaboration that's currently happening between those agencies on ocean acidification monitoring and opportunities that you might see in the future for greater collaboration in order to increase the efficiency of monitoring and data sharing.
My job title is Science Liaison, and I worked for NOAA for 17 years. And I know most of the people at PMEL in Seattle and the NOAA lab in Miami, and we have a very good program with them. And like I said, the Coast Guard is using aircraft to measure atmospheric gases in Alaska. So we have very good cooperation. And the idea was to use these wave gliders to go to the NOAA monitoring stations, which are fixed, and intercalibrate with them and then send them out to measure the rest of the areas where these are. So we have good collaboration with NOAA, and we also have a program very interactive now with NASA, and NASA is a full partner in this. They're working on the manned aircraft stuff that we carry their sensors on our Coast Guard C-130s in Alaska to calibrate the satellites. They use the same sensors from the satellites to look down. The NOAA people take the gas samples on the C-130s, and they make the plane fly all kinds of crazy ways. And we've been doing that for every 2 weeks for 3 years now, for 9 months of the year in Alaska. And the other component is the folks at NASA Ames have an unmanned aircraft program, and they are building the sensors for monitoring these gases on unmanned aircraft as well. And they're just now getting their first field experiments out. They decided, like anybody sensible, to go to Costa Rica and fly over a volcano. Let's go to a big source first. But they are also flying this summer in the Arctic, and we have that in conjunction with both NOAA and the Coast Guard. So I would say for those agencies, it's very integrated. There's a little bit of integration with BOEM that we're working on now, and we've had several conferences on getting that integration going, and we have committees that are set up. There is a committee that's managed by BOEM, which I helped set up, so it includes the Navy, NASA, NOAA, I'm going to forget people, but it's an interagency committee for autonomous systems use in the Arctic, specifically in their case to look for methane seeps and methane gas coming out of the seafloor, because as the seafloor heats up, methane comes out, and any pipeline that's going across the seafloor that has methane bubbling up underneath it is a big problem, and that's why the Coast Guard is involved. We don't want to have oil spills. We want to know where these are. So those are the agencies right now that I know of that are coordinating, and I would say because as the budget declined, the agencies were forced to work together, so we've been doing that. So.
All right, well, thank you very much to our panelists.